Imagine this. You are a French ambassador in 1538, entering King Francis II's private chambers at the Palace of Fontainebleau. The smell hits you first, thick perfume attempting to mask something darker underneath. Behind silk curtains embroidered with gold thread, you hear giggling, then unmistakable sounds of pleasure. Your mission concerns urgent matters of state, the Spanish threatening war, but the king's current entertainment has cost more than your annual salary. 3 times over. What you're about to witness will reveal how one man's insatiable appetites bankrupted the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Think Renaissance kings were dignified patrons of art and culture? Think the French court was about refined manners and intellectual pursuit. The truth about Francis Yu is so much darker, so systematically destructive, that it makes modern celebrity scandals look like minor accounting errors. This king spent more on his pleasure estates than on national defense. He maintained over 300 documented mistresses, each requiring palaces, allowances, and noble titles. By 1540, annual expenditure on royal pleasure consumed 40% of the entire crown revenue. 40%. Not on military campaigns, not on infrastructure, not on the people. On satisfying one man's appetites that grew more extreme with each passing year. The cold stone walls of Fontainebleau hold secrets that historians have sanitized into cultural achievement. But the account books tell a different story. A story of systematic exploitation, economic catastrophe, and human suffering hidden behind Renaissance splendor. You're about to discover the real cost of absolute power combined with unchecked desire. Francis I was born in 1494, ascending to the French throne in 1515 at age 21. He inherited a stable treasury containing 800,000 livres, a military fresh from victories, and a kingdom positioned to dominate Europe. His wife, Claude of France, was a political marriage that would produce 7 children. She was pious, dutiful, and utterly irrelevant to Francis's actual interests. The young king had grown up hearing stories of Italian splendor, of Venetian courtesans, of pleasures beyond what provincial French nobility could imagine. He was determined to transform his court into something unprecedented. The Italian wars provided convenient justification for military spending, but they also opened Francis's eyes to possibilities. When he captured Milan in 1515, he didn't just bring back artwork and books. He brought back ideas about organized pleasure, about systematizing desire, about creating institutions dedicated to royal satisfaction. The Renaissance culture Francis famously patronized wasn't separate from his obsessions. It was the aesthetic framework that made those obsessions acceptable. Beauty justified everything. By 1518, Fontainebleau had become the center of a court employing over 10,000 attendants. The palace sprawled across grounds that seemed to expand monthly, new wings appearing with suspicious regularity. Francis ruled as an absolute monarch in an age when divine right meant no one could question royal decisions. No advisor could refuse him. No churchman could condemn him. No family could protect their daughters from him. The tradition of royal mistresses was nothing new in French history, but what Francis created was something else entirely. He didn't just take lovers, he industrialized desire. The creation of La Petite Bande in 1518 at Amboise marked the moment royal pleasure became institutional policy. The name sounds almost charming, the little band, like a musical ensemble. But this was 300 noble women, carefully selected, lavishly maintained, and rotated through the king's chambers according to schedules managed by professional coordinators. Diane de Poitiers was recruited at age 19, plucked from provincial nobility because someone at court noticed her distinctive beauty. Anne de Pisseleu elevated from minor gentry to become Duchess of Étampes purely through royal favor. These weren't romantic affairs. This was a system. The selection process operated like a twisted debutante season. Noble families throughout France received hints, suggestions, that the king might appreciate meeting their daughters. Refusing wasn't really an option. A family that denied the king access to their daughter faced social exile, loss of positions, economic pressure that could destroy them within months. So fathers smiled and mothers wept privately as they dressed their teenage daughters in expensive gowns and sent them to Fontainebleau. The girls arrived terrified, excited, desperate, hopeful. They had no idea what they were entering. Training began immediately. Francis imported tutors from Venice, specialists in arts of pleasure that shocked even experienced French courtesans. The young women learned techniques, positions, theatrical performances designed to satisfy royal fantasies that grew more elaborate yearly. They learned to compete with each other, to develop specialties that might earn them lasting favor. They learned that their value lasted only as long as their novelty. Most women cycled through the system within 2 years before being married off to minor nobles, damaged goods given as rewards to loyal servants. The architecture of Chambord, that magnificent chateau that tourists admire today, was specifically designed for voyeurism. Hidden passages ran behind bedroom walls. Observation points looked down into bathing chambers. Secret staircases allowed the king to move between chambers without being seen in hallways. The famous double helix staircase wasn't just aesthetic genius. It let people ascend and descend without encountering each other, ensuring discretion for the constant traffic of women moving through the palace. Every element of design served desire. Competition among the women was encouraged, cultivated, used to extract maximum effort. The woman who pleased the king most extravagantly might earn a title, an estate, permanent security. The others faced uncertain futures. They smiled through humiliation, performed enthusiasm they didn't feel, and counted the days until they could escape. Meanwhile, their families bore crushing costs. Maintaining a daughter in the petite band required wardrobes that cost thousands of livres, gifts to curry favor with other courtiers, apartments in Paris for when the court traveled. Noble families bankrupted themselves maintaining daughters in sexual servitude they couldn't refuse. Budget documents from 1522 reveal annual expenditure of 200,000 livres on household entertainment. That phrase, household entertainment, covered salaries for coordinators, payments to women who earned royal favor, maintenance of the pleasure quarters, and procurement of luxuries from across Europe. Venetian silks, Turkish perfumes, Spanish wines, Italian musicians. Everything necessary to create an atmosphere of constant indulgence. Letters from Marguerite of Navarre, Francis's sister, criticized the system she witnessed daily. The Venetian ambassador's reports from the 1520s describe nightly entertainments that shocked a diplomat from a city famous for its courtesans. But the petite bande was just the public face of Francis's obsessions, the part visible to courtiers who learned not to see. What happened in the private chambers, in spaces being constructed even as the public palace expanded, would make these official arrangements look like innocent courtly romance. Construction began on Château de Chambord in 1519 and continued until Francis's death in 1547. 440 rooms, 84 staircases. Original budget estimates projected 50,000 livres total cost. The final accounting showed 1,800,000 livres spent, and the chateau still wasn't finished. That budget overrun of 36 times the initial estimate wasn't due to architectural ambition. It was because entire wings were being built that never appeared on official plans. Secret construction at Fontainebleau between 1528 and 1530 added chambers that required Italian specialists in entertainment facility design. These weren't bedrooms. They were purpose-built spaces incorporating mechanical innovations that Leonardo da Vinci had sketched in his final years, rotating beds that could be repositioned without disturbing occupants, automated curtain systems controlled by hidden pulleys, mirrored ceilings created with Venetian glass that cost more per square foot than the gold leaf covering the public throne room. Underground tunnels connected royal chambers to entertainment rooms, allowing movement invisible to regular palace staff. Only trusted servants knew the full layout. Those who learned too much disappeared into provincial postings or convenient accidents. The paranoia surrounding these spaces was justified. If the true purpose became too widely known, even absolute monarchy had limits. Revolts had started over less. Turkish bathhouse systems required 40 dedicated servants working in shifts to maintain proper temperatures and water flow. The engineering was remarkable, drawing water from sources half a mile away, heating it through systems of copper pipes, creating steam rooms and soaking pools that wouldn't be matched in European architecture for another century. The baths weren't for cleanliness. They were stages for aquatic entertainments that required specially trained participants. Imagine you're a mason working on Chambord's secret wing in 1524. You've been sworn to silence on pain of death. Your family is essentially hostage to your discretion. The rooms you're building have no windows, only elaborate ventilation systems that draw air from hidden shafts. The walls are double thick for soundproofing, limestone backed with cork imported from Portugal. You install anchor points whose purpose isn't clear until Italian craftsmen arrive with their specialized furniture. The beds have straps. The chairs have unusual angles. The tables are padded and reinforced. You understand then what you're building, and you understand why silence isn't optional. The Theatre of Venus, completed in 1532, was supposedly a private performance space for theatrical presentations. The architecture mimicked Greek Revival style that wouldn't become fashionable publicly for another 2 decades. But this wasn't for watching plays. The raised stage, the tiered seating for select audiences, the surprisingly robust construction of furniture pieces. This was for performances of a very different nature. Women from the Petite Bande acted out scenarios Francis devised, elaborate fantasies involving costumes, props, and increasingly complex choreography. The economic impact of this construction was catastrophic. In 1525, Francis was captured at the Battle of Pavia and held for ransom by Charles d'Estafide of Spain. The ransom demanded was 2 million écus, an astronomical sum that required emergency taxation and forced loans from nobility. France barely scraped together the amount. That same year, spending on pleasure palace renovations totaled 1,800,000 écus. The king spent nearly as much on his entertainment facilities as his freedom cost. In 1527, France declared crown bankruptcy for the first time in a century. Account books from the period reveal the priority structure. Military salaries went unpaid for months. Infrastructure projects were abandoned mid-construction. But the payments to Italian craftsmen working on the secret wings at Fontainebleau arrived promptly. The shipments of Turkish carpets and Venetian mirrors continued without interruption. The recruitment and maintenance of the Petite Bande never paused. Francis had his priorities, and the kingdom's solvency wasn't among them. Historical records document the scope of the disaster. Brantome's Lives of Fair and Gallant Ladies, written in the 1540s, describes the secret chambers with barely concealed horror. The master builder's diary for Chambord, preserved in regional archives, contains entries about construction that couldn't be explained to auditors. Papal Nuncio reports to Rome from 1529 express shock at expenditures that exceeded Vatican spending on all church construction in France. The evidence was everywhere for those willing to see it. You've just witnessed how Francis transformed royal palaces into pleasure factories that cost more than military campaigns. The deeper you go into these Renaissance secrets, the more twisted the royal priorities become. If uncovering how power and obsession bankrupted nations feeds your hunger for historical truth, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into the forbidden archives of European monarchy. What comes next will show you the human cost of Francis's appetites, the lives destroyed, the families ruined, and the kingdom brought to its knees. Because this architectural excess was just the beginning of the economic collapse that would cripple France for generations. The forced loan of 1527 extracted 800,000 livres from French nobility, through mechanisms that were taxation in all but name. Letters went out to every significant family demanding voluntary contributions to help the kingdom recover from the Pavia ransom. The amounts weren't suggestions. Families who contributed insufficiently faced investigations into their loyalty, their business dealings, their fitness for the positions they held. Most paid. Those who resisted found themselves ruined within months. By 1532, the crown jewels were being sold at Antwerp. Not all of them, just pieces that wouldn't be missed immediately. A diamond here, a ruby there, medieval crowns that could be explained away as outdated. The sales raised approximately 400,000 livres, money that disappeared into the endless appetite of construction and maintenance. The crown jewelers' inventory, preserved in French National Archives, shows progressive liquidation of treasures accumulated over centuries. Each sale was supposed to be the last necessary. Each was followed by another within months. Currency debasement in 1538 reduced the silver content of French coins by 30%. Merchants throughout Europe noticed immediately. French currency lost value in international markets. Trade became more expensive. Imports cost more. But the immediate influx of precious metals freed by reducing coin quality provided another 700,000 livres for crown spending. Guess where that money went? The sale of government offices in 1542 represented the final stage of economic cannibalization. Positions in royal administration, judicial posts, military commissions, all went on sale to anyone who could pay. The prices were substantial. A judgeship in a provincial court cost 50,000 livres. The position came with authority but no salary, the expectation being that the holder would recoup their investment through corruption. This system would plague French governance for over a century, but it raised immediate funds. 3 million livres in the first year alone. Francis spent 2 million of that on completing the latest renovation at Fontainebleau. Tax rebellions erupted in southwest France in 1546. Peasants refused to pay assessments that had tripled in a decade. Regional nobles reported that their territories were exhausted, bled dry. The king's response was to send military forces to collect taxes by violence. The troops, themselves unpaid for months, enthusiastically looted whatever they could find. The cycle of extraction and violence fed on itself, destabilizing entire provinces. Imagine you are Henri de Valois, a provincial noble in Burgundy in 1543. Your family has served the crown for 200 years. Your estates are productive, your tenants reasonably content. Then the king's messenger arrives demanding 10,000 livres as a loan that everyone knows will never be repaid. The amount is calculated to hurt without quite destroying you. Your daughter was already taken for the petite band 3 years ago. You haven't seen her since. Now your wealth follows her into the king's insatiable system. You have no choice. Refusal means charges of treason, confiscation of everything, probable execution. You sell land your grandfather acquired. You dismiss servants your family has employed for generations. You deliver the money with a smile and assurances of loyalty. This is the hidden tax of royal pleasure, paid in gold and daughters and futures destroyed. Tax records show the disproportionate burden placed on nobility. The common people were already taxed to the limit. Further extraction from peasants would cause revolts too large to contain, so the nobility bore the weight. Bankruptcy declarations from major merchant families multiplied through the 1540s. These were families that had thrived for generations, suddenly unable to meet obligations because royal demands consumed their capital. Letters from Francis to his advisors survive, casual notes about priorities. One from 1541 reads, "The kingdom can wait, my appetites cannot." He wasn't joking. Chronicles from the period document bread price increases of 300% between 1530 and 1545. This was partly due to crop failures, but mostly due to currency debasement and economic chaos. People starved while Fontainebleau hosted 3-day feasts featuring delicacies imported from across the known world. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was deliberate demonstration that the king lived by different rules than his subjects. The military consequences were severe. Soldiers went unpaid for so long that mutinies became routine. Units refused orders. Officers couldn't maintain discipline when they couldn't provide basic supplies. France lost Italian territories not because of Spanish military superiority, but because French forces literally couldn't afford to campaign. The money that should have paid for gunpowder and provisions had been redirected to gilding bedroom ceilings and importing exotic courtesans. Spanish power rose directly from French decline. Charles V understood that Francis's obsessions were strategic vulnerabilities. Spanish intelligence reports from the period, preserved in Simancas archives, explicitly discuss waiting for French economic collapse rather than engaging in expensive warfare. The strategy worked perfectly. By 1544, France was forced to sign humiliating peace terms because continuing war was financially impossible. The Protestant Reformation gained ground in economically devastated regions where traditional authority had lost credibility. When people saw their king bankrupting the nation for personal pleasure while preaching divine right, the arguments of religious reformers found receptive audiences. The religious wars that would tear France apart in coming decades had roots in the economic and moral catastrophe of Francis's reign. But the economic numbers, as horrifying as they are, don't capture the human toll of this systematic exploitation. Behind every statistic was a person whose life was destroyed by royal appetite. Anne de Heilly attempted suicide in 1534 after being replaced as primary mistress. She had been Duchess of Étampes, wielding significant power for 6 years. Then Francis's attention shifted to a younger woman, and Anne's status evaporated overnight. She swallowed poison, but was discovered by servants. After recovery, she was married off to an elderly baron and disappeared from court. Her letters from this period, preserved by her family, described the psychological torture of being discarded after years of intimate service. The Baron de Montmorency was executed in 1540 for the crime of refusing to provide his daughter to the Petite Bande. He was a decorated military officer, a man of unquestioned loyalty who had fought in 3 campaigns. But when recruiters approached about his 13-year-old daughter, he said no. The charges brought against him were vague, fabricated accusations of financial irregularities. His trial lasted 1 day. He was beheaded within a week. The message to other nobles was unmistakable. Convent records from 1543 show 67 women formerly of the Petite Bande now living in religious houses. These weren't voluntary religious vocations. These were disposal sites for women who had aged out of royal interest or become pregnant or simply lost the competition for favor. The convents accepted them because turning away women with royal connections was unwise. The women spent their remaining years in prayer and silence, trying to find meaning in lives that had been consumed for someone else's pleasure. Death registers reveal 12 women died in childbirth to royal bastards between 1530 and 1545. These were documented cases where paternity was openly acknowledged. The actual number was certainly higher. Francis acknowledged perhaps a dozen illegitimate children over his reign. Estimates based on the number of women cycled through his chambers suggest the real total exceeds 40. Most were never recognized, never supported, left to their mothers to raise in poverty or shame. Françoise de Foix had been a primary mistress from 1518 to 1533, one of the longest tenures in the system. She bore Francis 2 children he acknowledged. When his attention moved elsewhere, she discovered that 15 years of royal favor had left her with nothing secure. Her family had spent their wealth maintaining her position. She owned properties that reverted to the crown when royal grants expired. She died in poverty in 1537, aged 41, having outlived her usefulness by 4 years. Marie de Langeac was confined to a convent in 1539 after becoming pregnant. She was 17. The pregnancy was confirmed to be royal, but Francis had no interest in another bastard. Marie was removed from court, sent to a remote convent in Auvergne, and forbidden from ever speaking about her time at Fontainebleau. Her daughter was raised by nuns, never knowing her father's identity. Marie died at age 23 from complications of a second pregnancy. The father was never identified, but convent records suggest abuse by someone with access to the facility. Jeanne d'Albret entered the Petite Bande at age 12 in 1540. After 2 years of service, she was married off to an Italian duke, 40 years her senior. The marriage was arranged as diplomatic courtesy, payment to an ally. Jeanne would later describe those years as a living death, her childhood stolen for purposes she couldn't understand at the time. She eventually escaped the marriage and remarried, but the psychological damage lasted her entire life. Medical consequences spread through the court like plague. Royal physician Jean Fernel documented an epidemic of syphilis affecting over 200 courtiers by 1543. The disease had been introduced by Italian visitors in the 1520s and spread rapidly through the Petite Bande system. Treatment options were primitive. Mercury cures caused as much suffering as the disease, leading to tooth loss, tremors, and eventual madness. Francis himself showed advanced symptoms by 1545, his face increasingly covered by sores he hid with makeup and perfume. Treatment costs for syphilis consumed another substantial portion of crown revenue. Imported medications from Arab physicians, experimental cures from university doctors, mercury in quantities that required special procurement from Spanish mines. The account books list 50,000 livres annually for medical supplies by the mid-1540s. Much of that was treating consequences of royal sexual excess. Imagine you are Louise, 17 years old, chosen for the Petite Bande in 1542. Your father celebrated the selection. Royal favor meant advancement, opportunity, security for your whole family. 4 years later, you've borne the king a daughter he refuses to acknowledge. You have mercury poisoning from treatments for the disease he gave you. Your hands shaking uncontrollably, your gums receding, teeth falling out. Your family has spent their fortune maintaining your wardrobe and household at court, bankrupting themselves for your service. The king moved on to younger women last year. You're being sent to a convent in Normandy, a living burial for women who know too much. This was the honor your father celebrated. This was the opportunity that destroyed your life. The societal acceptance of this system reveals how thoroughly power can corrupt an entire culture. Court poets wrote verses celebrating royal virility, comparing Francis to gods of ancient mythology. The Church granted special dispensations for royal behavior that would have condemned ordinary men to hell. Spanish and English ambassadors reported with disgust to their monarchs, but took no action beyond pearl-clutching. French nobility competed to provide the next favorite, hoping their daughter might be the one who secured lasting position. The normalization was complete. What had started as shocking excess became routine. Courtiers developed euphemisms for discussing the system. Writers crafted justifications based on classical precedents. Philosophers argued that royal pleasure served the public good by keeping the king content and generous. The mental gymnastics required to defend the indefensible became an art form in itself. Francis's final year revealed the ultimate horror of unchecked obsession. By 1546, he was visibly dying. Syphilis had progressed to the point where daily functioning required increasingly powerful medications. His physician's reports describe a man whose body was failing even as his appetites remained undiminished. The kingdom was bankrupt. Enemy armies threatened borders, and still Francis demanded new entertainments nightly. Royal physician reports from January 1547 state His Majesty's condition deteriorates, yet he demands new women recruited from Brittany. 12 were to arrive by month's end. The final accounting that March showed crown debt of 48 million livres against annual revenue of only 12 million. France was insolvent. 4 times annual income in debt, with no plan for repayment, no ability to borrow more, no options beyond collapse or miracle. An emergency meeting with the Dauphin Henri in February 1547 addressed succession and the catastrophic financial situation. Henri would inherit an empty treasury, massive debts, and a kingdom whose economic foundations had been systematically destroyed. The briefing documents, preserved in royal archives, make for devastating reading. They catalogued 30 years of prioritizing pleasure over policy, personal appetite over national interest. Imagine you are Jean de Saint-Gelais, royal treasurer, presenting these final accounts to the dying king in his bedchamber in January 1547. His face is covered in sores hidden by thick theatrical makeup. The smell of decay permeates the air despite incense burning in every corner. You explain that the kingdom is bankrupt. No funds remain for military operations, for infrastructure maintenance, for basic governance. Francis waves his hand dismissively, the gesture weak but imperious. "Add it to the debt," he rasps through damaged vocal cords. "I require the 12 new women from Brittany by month's end. Behind you, architects wait with plans for another hidden wing at Fontainebleau. The king who patronized Leonardo da Vinci and built Chambord will die leaving France on the brink of civil war, all because no one could tell him no, because absolute power combined with insatiable appetite recognizes no limits." Francis Lier died March 31, 1547, at age 52. His successor, Henri II, inherited catastrophic debt that took 30 years to begin addressing. French power didn't truly recover until Henri IV took the throne in 1589, 42 years after Francis's death. An entire generation lost to financial consequences of one man's obsessions. The kingdom that might have dominated Europe for centuries was crippled by royal excess that consumed resources faster than the economy could generate them. The Renaissance glory. France is remembered for the chateau tourists visit, the cultural achievements historians celebrate. All of it was built on borrowed money they couldn't repay. Every palace, every artwork, every architectural innovation came at the cost of economic collapse that reverberated for decades. The rise of Spanish dominance in European affairs directly resulted from French weakness. The religious wars that tore France apart through the later 16th century were partly funded by economic desperation Francis created. The loss of Italian territories and Mediterranean influence stemmed from inability to maintain military operations. France's decline from potential hegemon to struggling regional power can be traced to decisions made in bedchambers at Fontainebleau. The model Francis established for royal excess wasn't forgotten. Louis XIV would learn entirely wrong lessons from his predecessor, building Versailles on similar principles of architectural excess and centralized pleasure. But Louis at least managed to avoid bankruptcy, barely. He had Francis's example as warning, even if he didn't fully heed it. "Francis, I wasn't a Renaissance prince of culture who appreciated beauty and patronized artists. He was an addict who happened to have absolute power. His appetites weren't romantic or artistic. They were destructive obsessions that consumed a nation's wealth and destroyed countless lives." The patronage of Leonardo, the construction of Chambord, the flowering of French Renaissance culture, these weren't separate from his obsessions. They were camouflage for them, aesthetic justification that made the systematic exploitation acceptable. The women of the petite band weren't willing participants in courtly love. They were economic conscripts whose families had no choice but to comply with royal demands. The nobles, forced into loans, weren't supporting their king. They were being extorted by a system where refusal meant destruction. The merchants who went bankrupt weren't bad businessmen. They were victims of an economy where royal pleasure outweighed commercial stability. The account books reveal truth that palace tours obscure. For every livre spent on Leonardo's workshop, 3 livres went to maintaining the pleasure infrastructure. For every innovation in architecture, countless families were bankrupted funding it. For every cultural achievement Francis is remembered for, dozens of lives were destroyed making it possible. We remember Francis Friersdijk as the king who brought Leonardo da Vinci to France, who built Château de Chambord, who made France a center of Renaissance culture. We forget the 300 women cycled through his organized pleasure system. We forget the nobles bankrupted by forced loans funding his obsessions. We forget the kingdom brought to its knees because one man couldn't control his appetites. History sanitizes royal excess, calling it cultural patronage and artistic achievement. The account books, the medical records, the letters from victims, they tell a different story entirely. You came into this story thinking Francis I was a Renaissance king who appreciated beauty and culture. Now you understand he was a man whose obsessions bankrupted France and destroyed lives while historians celebrated his patronage of the arts. This transformation from sanitized history to brutal truth is exactly why these deep dives matter. If methodically uncovering how power really works, hidden behind cultural achievements and romantic legends, satisfies your need to understand how monarchies functioned, subscribing keeps you ahead of the curve. While others believe the palace tour guide version of elegant royal courts and refined cultural patronage, you'll know what the account books and medical records actually reveal. Your time investment in learning these truths about how royal power operated, how absolute authority enabled systematic destruction, pays dividends in understanding how charismatic leadership functions across all eras. The patterns Francis established of using culture to justify excess, of sacrificing national interest for personal appetite, of destroying lives while claiming divine right, these patterns repeat throughout history whenever power exists without accountability. The legacy persists in how we remember monarchy itself. We tour the palaces and admire the architecture, rarely asking about the human cost of construction. We celebrate cultural flowering without examining economic roots. We romanticize historical periods while ignoring systematic exploitation that funded them. Francis I forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how power operates when unchecked, how institutions fail when unable to resist authority, and how individual appetite can consume collective resources with devastating results. The Renaissance wasn't separate from the exploitation. It was built on it, funded by it, made possible through it. That's the truth the account books reveal. That's the reality behind the beauty tourist photograph. That's the human cost of absolute monarchy, measured in bankrupted families, destroyed lives, and a kingdom brought to its knees by one man who confused appetite with authority and pleasure with power.